The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the New York charity gala was thick with anticipation. The evening was meant to be a celebration of elegance and goodwill, drawing together high society figures, philanthropists, and media elites under the dazzling glow of crystal chandeliers. Glasses of champagne clinked as hushed conversations circled around the latest headlines. Among the distinguished guests, Melania Trump stood out in a breathtaking midnight blue gown, exuding grace and poise. Despite the political turbulence surrounding her husband, she had always maintained her dignity, choosing to focus on philanthropy and remaining above the fray. Tonight was no exception. As she stepped onto the stage to deliver her speech on children's education and humanitarian aid, the room fell silent, captivated by her presence. She spoke with quiet confidence, her Slovenian accent lending a unique elegance to her words. But just as she was about to finish, a voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda?" The question was laced with sharp mockery. The source? A tall, impeccably dressed journalist with an unmistakable air of self-assurance. His microphone was held like a weapon, his stance unapologetically confrontational. David Calloway. A political correspondent notorious for his aggressive takedowns of conservatives under the guise of journalistic integrity. A murmur rippled through the audience as people exchanged knowing glances. This was no ordinary Q&A. Melania's lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, Calloway pressed further. "Your husband has been accused of dividing the country, of fostering hate," he continued, emboldened by the captive audience. "And yet, here you stand, presenting yourself as a role model. Don't you think the real role models are those fighting against him?" The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with tension. A few reporters smirked, sensing a viral moment in the making. Then, before Melania could respond, another voice cut through the silence. Firm, unwavering. "That's enough." All heads turned. Barron Trump had stepped forward. Gone was the quiet boy the world had once seen in the White House. Now 17, tall, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had grown up under the public eye, he was no longer just the president's son. He was his own person. And in that moment, he had one clear purpose. He would not allow anyone to disrespect his mother. Moving past the tables, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set, Barron strode onto the stage without hesitation, positioning himself directly between his mother and the journalist. His mere presence shifted the energy in the room. "Excuse me." Calloway arched an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback, but quickly regained his composure. Barron didn't blink. "You can ask tough questions," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "But what you're doing isn't journalism, it's bullying." The room erupted into hushed whispers. Caught off guard, Calloway let out a breathy chuckle, feigning amusement. "Oh. And I suppose you, the president's son, are going to lecture me on media ethics?" Barron tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze locked onto Calloway's. Barron's gaze remained locked onto Calloway's, unwavering and razor-sharp. Then, with a measured calm, he spoke. "I'm going to show you what respect looks like." A wave of tension rippled through the ballroom, no longer a mere undercurrent but an undeniable force. Every eye was on Barron. No one had anticipated his intervention, certainly not like this, not with such composed confidence. David Calloway, the seasoned journalist who had instigated this confrontation, was still processing what was happening. He had expected hesitation, maybe an awkward misstep. Something he could spin into a viral moment. What he hadn't foreseen was Barron Trump standing his ground with an authority that completely disrupted the script. For the briefest moment, the smirk on Calloway's face faltered. Then, regaining his posture, he let out a dry chuckle and shook his head, feigning amusement. "Respect?" he repeated mockingly. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family are in any position to lecture the press on respect." A few uneasy chuckles flickered through the audience, but most remained frozen, watching the unexpected showdown unfold. Barron didn't flinch. His posture remained firm, his voice unwavering. "You're free to ask any tough question you want," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "But that wasn't a question. You were trying to humiliate my mother." The smirk on Calloway's face faded slightly, but he kept his stance. "Mrs. Trump is a public figure," he countered. "She should expect scrutiny." Barron took a deliberate step forward, his height forcing Calloway to look up slightly. "Then why didn't you ask her about the work she's doing tonight? About the children she's helping?" A murmur swept through the crowd. It was a simple question, yet it cut deep. Calloway hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. He knew the truth as well as anyone in the room. He wasn't here to discuss charity. He wasn't interested in Melania Trump's accomplishments. He had come with one goal. To create controversy, to provoke, to generate a headline. Before he could regroup, Barron pressed on. "You came here looking for a viral moment. You didn't care about what this event is actually about. You just wanted a soundbite, something to throw on social media for a few quick likes from people who already agree with you." The room was now completely silent. Guests exchanged glances, realizing that Barron wasn't just reacting, he was in control of the moment. Calloway's confidence wavered. His gaze flickered toward the other journalists in the room, almost as if searching for support. But no one spoke. They weren't used to being called out like this, not by a Trump, and certainly not by a 17-year-old. Behind him, Melania placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. She said nothing, but her expression spoke volumes. Pride. Strength. A silent affirmation, I'm right here with you. Calloway, sensing his control slipping, forced another smirk and crossed his arms. You're young, Barron, he said, shaking his head. You don't understand how this works. Barron didn't even blink. No, he replied smoothly. I understand exactly how this works. His voice was steady, his presence unshaken. I've watched people like you attack my family since I was a kid. The only thing I didn't expect was that you'd be desperate enough to come after a woman who's spent her life helping others. Calloway's smirk disappeared entirely. Barron had taken control of the narrative, and the entire room knew it. Attacking a woman who has done nothing but dedicate herself to helping others, how pathetic. A ripple of murmurs swept through the ballroom. Somewhere near the back, an audible gasp broke the silence. Even some of the seasoned journalists, those who had anticipated another routine takedown of a Trump, sat in stunned silence. David Calloway's face reddened slightly, his once smug demeanor faltering for the first time. Before he could gather himself to respond, another voice rose from the crowd. He's right. All heads turned. A distinguished man in a tailored suit stood near one of the round tables. His salt and pepper hair and commanding presence suggested someone of influence, perhaps a respected businessman, maybe even a donor. His gaze was locked onto Calloway, his expression unreadable. This is a charity event, he said firmly. Not the place for petty political stunts. A new wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Several attendees nodded in agreement. For the first time that evening, David Calloway looked uncertain. His moment, the one he had carefully orchestrated, was slipping away, and Barron Trump wasn't done yet. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with tension and expectation. No one had seen a Trump take on the press quite like this before, not with anger, not with evasion, but with cold, calculated precision. Barron wasn't lashing out. He was dismantling Calloway, piece by piece. The once confident journalist clenched his jaw, aware that he was rapidly losing control of the narrative. He had come here expecting to rattle Melania Trump into a flustered misstep, a headline-worthy stumble. Instead, he had walked straight into a storm he hadn't seen coming. But Calloway wasn't ready to concede just yet. Letting out a forced chuckle, he shook his head as if amused by Barron's defiance. You know, Barron, he said, his tone condescending. It's easy to stand up for your family when you've grown up in a golden tower. But out here in the real world, people like me have to ask the tough questions. That's what journalism is. A few scattered nods came from the usual suspects in the audience. But something felt different. The rhythm of the media's well-rehearsed attacks wasn't landing tonight. Calloway's words, intended to sound authoritative, instead carried a defensive, almost desperate edge. Barron tilted his head slightly, the faintest smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He had him. The real world, he echoed, his voice smooth, deliberate. You mean the real world where my mother is here supporting charities, while you're here trying to make a headline by humiliating her? Calloway's smirk vanished. Barron stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a presence that commanded attention. His voice never rose, but the weight behind his words made the room hang on every syllable. You want to talk about the real world? Fine. He gestured toward the crowd. How many people here tonight came to support a cause? To help children, to promote education, to give back? A few guests raised their hands. Others nodded in agreement. Even those who weren't Trump supporters hadn't come here for a political showdown, they had come for the mission. Barron turned back to Calloway, his gaze unwavering. And how many people came here to watch you make this about yourself? The crowd stirred again. This time, a few chuckles rippled through the room. The balance had shifted. Calloway was no longer in control of the moment. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Barron cut him off. No, really, Barron continued, a mock patience in his voice. I'll wait. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in realization. The tables had turned completely. Calloway had walked in expecting to dominate the conversation. Instead, he had just been completely outmaneuvered. Go ahead, take your time, Barron said, his voice steady, almost amused. Because as far as I can tell, the only person in this room who thought this was about politics was you. A few people clapped. Not out of politeness, but out of agreement. Barron folded his arms, his eyes locked onto Calloway like a predator assessing its prey. You came here hoping to embarrass my mother, he continued, his tone unwavering. Instead, you embarrassed yourself. The room erupted. Even those who weren't necessarily Trump supporters couldn't deny what had just happened. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Barron had done something no one expected. He had turned the tables on the media, beating them at their own game. Calloway's face was now visibly red. He tried to speak, but the moment had already slipped through his fingers. The confidence, the arrogance, it had all drained away. And then, just to seal the moment, Barron leaned in slightly, his voice smooth and deliberate. Next time, he said, his tone carrying the weight of finality. If you want to attack a Trump, maybe try picking on someone your own size. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Calloway stiffened. There was no comeback. He had played his game, and tonight, he had lost. Barron turned back toward his mother, standing tall and composed. In that instant, one thing became crystal clear to everyone in the room. The youngest Trump had just made his mark. Even as the applause continued, Calloway felt the weight of the situation sinking in. His once confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a strained, forced expression as he struggled to maintain his composure. But the crowd saw it. The unraveling of a man who had miscalculated his moment. Barron stood firm, his posture unshaken, his gaze locked onto Calloway like a lion watching a wounded adversary. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Calloway was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. Yet, the journalist wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Adjusting his tie, he let out a strained chuckle, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "So that's it then?" he said, forcing an air of amusement. "You're saying I can't ask questions just because they make your family uncomfortable?" Barron's expression remained unchanged, his voice as smooth as ever. "You didn't ask a question," he replied evenly. "You made an accusation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Even those who didn't necessarily support the Trumps could see the truth in Barron's words. Calloway's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered to the other journalists in the room, silently seeking backup. But none of them spoke. They all understood what had just happened. Calloway had lost control of the room. Barron took another step forward, not with aggression, but with unmistakable confidence. His presence alone was enough to make Calloway instinctively step back. "You tried to paint my mother as a villain," Barron continued, his tone measured but firm. "But you failed. Because the truth is, she's here making a difference, helping people." He gestured toward the charity banners hanging behind the stage, the faces of the children and families Melania's foundation had supported. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, Barron delivered the final blow. "And what are you doing?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. "Besides spreading negativity?" Calloway's face deepened to a shade of crimson. His confidence had crumbled, and his body betrayed him, shoulders tensed, fingers clenched tightly around the microphone as if it were the only thing grounding him. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. And the audience saw it. They weren't on his side anymore. Some shook their heads in quiet disapproval, while others simply watched in stunned silence. Calloway swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, his voice lacking the bravado it once carried. Barron smirked, a knowing glint in his eye. "Then maybe," he said smoothly. "You should try doing it better." The crowd erupted. This time, it wasn't just polite applause, it was thunderous. Even those who had entered the room skeptical of the Trumps couldn't deny what had just unfolded. David Calloway had walked in expecting to dominate, to turn the night into a spectacle at the expense of Melania Trump. Instead, he had become the spectacle. And Barron Trump? He had just dismantled him, piece by piece, in front of the entire elite media establishment. Melania, who had been quietly observing, offered her son a small, proud smile. There was nothing left for her to say. Barron had spoken for both of them. Realizing there was no salvaging this disaster, Calloway lowered his microphone. And then, without another word, he turned away. The walk of shame had begun. Meanwhile, Barron didn't gloat, didn't revel in the moment. He simply turned back to his mother, standing firmly by her side. Because tonight, he wasn't just defending her, he was proving that the next generation of Trumps wasn't going anywhere. Calloway gripped his microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had lost. Completely. And the worst part? It wasn't because he had been shouted down. It wasn't because someone silenced him. It was because a 17-year-old had outclassed him in front of an entire room. The crowd was still buzzing. Some clapped, others whispered, and many simply stared at Calloway as if watching a man unravel in real time. Even his colleagues, the very journalists who had been ready to support his narrative, looked away, too embarrassed to be associated with what had just happened. But Calloway wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. He needed to regain control, to spin this back in his favor. Adjusting his tie, he forced a smirk and lifted the microphone one last time. "Well," he said, trying to sound amused, though his voice had lost its edge. "If you can't handle a little pushback, maybe politics isn't for you." Weak. A desperate attempt at one final jab. But Barron didn't even blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He simply smiled. Not a cocky grin, but a slow, knowing smile that sent a clear message. "That's all you've got?" And that was when Calloway knew. He was finished. He had thrown every tactic he had, every calculated attack, and yet Barron Trump stood there, untouched, composed, unshaken. The applause that followed wasn't just for Barron anymore, it was for the undeniable fact that Calloway had just buried himself. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone chuckled. A wealthy donor near the front leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her smile. Calloway saw it. He saw all of it. And in that moment, he knew. He hadn't just lost the argument. He had lost the room. He wasn't just walking away from this conversation, he was walking away a failure. Calloway's face tightened, his jaw clenched as he muttered something under his breath, barely audible over the hum of the crowd. But there was nothing left to say. With stiff, reluctant steps, he turned away and began his walk of shame. The cameras followed his every move. He had entered the ballroom expecting to dominate the narrative, to manufacture a headline at Melania Trump's expense. Instead, he had become the headline. And the world was about to witness it all. Meanwhile, Barron turned to his mother. Melania met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with the quiet grace and composure that had defined her for years, she simply reached out and straightened his suit jacket. Just a small, deliberate gesture, yet it spoke volumes. Barron smirked slightly, giving her a subtle nod before turning back to face the crowd. And then, as if on cue, the audience rose to their feet. The standing ovation was deafening, not just for Melania, not just for Barron, but for the moment itself. Something had changed. For years, people had underestimated him, dismissing him as nothing more than the youngest Trump. A boy in the background, overshadowed by his family's larger-than-life presence. But after tonight, no one would ever make that mistake again. David Calloway stood frozen, gripping his microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had lost completely. And the worst part? It wasn't because he had been shouted down. It wasn't because someone had silenced him. It was because an 18-year-old had outclassed him, calmly, methodically, and in front of an entire room of elites who had just witnessed the shift in real time. The energy in the room still buzzed. Some guests clapped, others whispered, and a few simply watched Calloway as though they were witnessing a man unravel before their eyes. Even his own colleagues, the journalists who had once been his allies, refused to meet his gaze, too embarrassed to be associated with what had just unfolded. But Calloway wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Desperate to salvage the wreckage, he forced a smirk, straightened his shoulders, and lifted the microphone for one final attempt at control. "Well," he said, trying to inject amusement into his voice, though the strain was evident. "If you can't handle a little pushback, maybe politics isn't for you." Weak. A hollow last-ditch effort to claw back relevance. But Barron didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't even step back. Instead, he simply smiled, slow, knowing, unshaken. A smile that sent a clear message. "That's all you've got?" And in that instant, Calloway understood. He was finished. He had thrown everything he had, every calculated insult, every practiced attack. And yet, Barron Trump stood there, untouched, composed, undefeated. The applause that followed wasn't just for Barron anymore, it was for the fact that Calloway had just buried himself. A ripple of murmur spread through the audience. Someone chuckled. A wealthy donor near the front leaned toward his wife, whispering something that made her smile. Calloway saw it. He saw all of it. And in that moment, the truth hit him with full force. He hadn't just lost the argument, he had lost the room. Calloway's shoulders tensed. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible over the hum of the crowd, before finally turning away. And with that, the walk of shame began. The cameras followed his every step, capturing the downfall of a man who had walked into the ballroom expecting to shape the headlines, only to become one himself. And the world? The world was going to see it. Meanwhile, Barron turned toward his mother. Melania looked at him, her expression unreadable for a brief moment. Then, with the quiet grace and composure that had defined her for years, she reached out and gently straightened the lapel of his suit jacket. A small gesture, but one that spoke louder than words. Barron smirked slightly, giving her a knowing nod before shifting his gaze back toward the room. And then, almost as if the entire ballroom had arrived at the same realization, people rose to their feet. The standing ovation was thunderous. Not just for Melania, not just for Barron, but for the undeniable truth that tonight, something had changed. For years, the world had underestimated him. To many, he had been little more than the youngest Trump, a quiet presence in the background. But after tonight, no one would ever make that mistake again. Barron Trump hadn't just defended his mother. He had proven that he was a force to be reckoned with. The way he stood his ground. The way he took control. The way he turned the tables with precision and composure. This wasn't just a debate, it was a statement. The confrontation between Barron Trump and David Calloway was more than just a debate. It was a testament to the power of composure, respect, and truth in an era dominated by sensationalism. It reminds us that true strength is not found in volume or aggression but in unwavering confidence and the courage to stand up for what is right. For older generations, this moment serves as a reflection of timeless values, dignity, respect, and the importance of speaking with purpose rather than impulse. Barron did not resort to anger or hostility. He met provocation with poise, exposing the journalist's intentions without ever losing control. This is a lesson for all of us. In moments of challenge, the most powerful response is one grounded in truth and self-assurance. In a world that often rewards those who shout the loudest, this story is a reminder that wisdom, patience, and steadfast character always prevail. It is not about winning arguments. It is about maintaining integrity. And in doing so, we do not just earn respect, we command it.